Picture this, you're walking through the marble-clad streets of ancient Rome. The year is 67 AD. The summer sun burns overhead as golden rays reflect off the gleaming facades of temples and colonnades. Senators wrapped in togas whisper under porticos. Merchants haggle in the markets, their voices rising above the din of clanking bronze coins. And then a procession approaches. Spectators part reverently. Roman guards in polished armor flank a regal litter, upon which lounges a radiant veiled woman in silken robes, her skin powdered pale, her cheeks tinged rose, her eyes downcast with a demure grace. Beside her, the emperor himself, Nero, struts with flamboyant pride. The crowd murmurs their praises. Nero's eyes, heavy-lidded with pleasure, never leave the figure beside him. But the whispers behind clasped hands tell a different story, because that woman was not a woman. That woman was once a boy. His name was Sporus. This is not merely a tale of Roman decadence. It is a narrative soaked in cruelty, delusion, and despair. A story of how power without limits consumes everything, including identity, dignity, and humanity itself. Today, we unravel the tragic fate of Sporus, a boy whose body and soul were warped to feed the fantasies of an emperor unmoored from reality. If you find value in these buried truths of the past, if you believe history's forgotten voices deserve to be heard, then please consider subscribing, hitting the like button, and joining this journey. And drop a comment to let me know where in the world you're listening from. I'd love to hear from you. Now, let us begin, not with Sporus, but with the architect of his tragedy, Nero. Nero Claudius Caesar. Augustus Germanicus was not always a monster. When he first ascended the throne at just 16, Rome rejoiced. The empire, weary of instability and paranoia under emperors like Caligula and Claudius, saw in Nero a fresh start. He was handsome, artistically inclined, and tutored by the philosopher Seneca, a beacon of stoic virtue. The early years of his reign saw tax reforms, support for the arts, even a ban on capital punishment. Citizens dared to hope, but hope in Rome was often fragile. The facade began to crack. Nero's thirst for adulation metastasized. His music, poetry, and theatrical performances, once quaint eccentricities, became imperial mandates. Nobles were required to sit through endless lyre recitals and dramatic readings. He raced chariots in the Circus Maximus. He believed himself divine, and when applause felt forced, he grew suspicious, then cruel. The deaths began to stack. His stepbrother Britannicus poisoned. His mother Agrippina, first nearly drowned, then stabbed to death. Advisors fell. Friends turned into enemies. Paranoia festered like a wound. And then came Poppaea Sabina. Poppaea was a vision. Known for her beauty, cunning, and ambition, she first captivated Nero while married to another man. That did not last long. She soon became his mistress, then his empress. But this was no mere affair. Nero fell for her with a fervor that bordered on spiritual worship. She was his Venus incarnate, his muse, his queen. He lavished her with jewels, palaces, entire cities' taxes redirected to fund her whims. But love under Nero's rule was a dangerous thing. Possessive, suffocating, and volatile. Poppaea was one of the few who dared speak back to Nero. She challenged him, teased him, tested his limits, and that was her fatal flaw. In the summer of 65 AD, their relationship hit a breaking point. One account, most commonly told by Suetonius, describes Poppaea confronting Nero over returning late from the races. They argued. Nero's rage erupted. He kicked her, perhaps in the abdomen, perhaps more than once. What we know is this: Poppaea was pregnant, and she died. Whether from the trauma of the blows or complications afterward, history is unclear, but her death shattered Nero. He reportedly wept uncontrollably. For days he would not eat. He did not sleep. He wandered the palace, calling her name. Her embalmed body was entombed with perfumes and jewels of staggering value, even by imperial standards. But the grief did not heal, it festered, and something inside Nero broke permanently. He could not accept her death, or perhaps he simply could not accept a world in which he had destroyed the one thing he claimed to love. And so the mind of the emperor, untethered from reality, unshackled by morality, began to search for a replacement. Not a new love, not a woman, no. Nero wanted Poppaea back. And then someone, perhaps a servant, perhaps a courtier eager to please, pointed out a young palace boy. Delicate, soft-featured, pale-skinned, with large almond-shaped eyes. A look uncannily like the late empress. His name was Sporus. Sporus was, by all accounts, a youth of humble status, possibly a freedman or the child of one, perhaps a eunuch already in service. The records are vague. After all, boys like Sporus were seldom remembered unless they touched the flame of power. and were burned by it. What is certain is this: he was young, vulnerable, powerless, and now noticed. Nero's gaze fell upon Sporus and did not waver. The fantasy began to take shape. In Sporus, Nero saw not a person, but a vessel, a canvas onto which he would paint the ghost of Poppaea. The first step was the most brutal: castration. We can only speculate at the setting. Perhaps it was under the polished arches of a private villa, or within the stone bowels of the palace. No matter the place, the act was the same: irreversible mutilation, sanctioned by an emperor. The boy's manhood was removed, his voice preserved, his body reshaped, and with it, his fate was sealed. He was no longer Sporus. Nero began to call him by another name, Poppaea. But this was only the beginning. Sporus was dressed in the empress's garments, silk gowns embroidered with gold. Pearls that once graced a woman now dangled from his ears. He was painted, perfumed, and paraded through the imperial halls. His hair curled in the style of Roman matrons, his gait trained to mimic the soft sway of feminine grace. And then, the final blow to reality. Nero married him. A full ceremony, witnessed by the court, officiated with pomp and legality. Nero took Sporus as his bride. The veil, the ring, the vows, the kiss. To the outside world, it was grotesque theater. To Nero, it was love reborn, or perhaps delusion cemented. The empire watched in silence. Senators bowed. Guards stood at attention. The few who scoffed did so behind closed doors, because in Rome, under Nero, laughter could be lethal. And Sporus, what of him? Imagine the terror, each day awakening to a body not your own, spoken to in a voice not yours, called by a name that belonged to someone else. Every gesture measured, every word rehearsed. One misstep, one crack in the illusion, and the emperor's wrath could fall like lightning. Did he mourn his past? Did he pray for death? Did he cling to fragments of his name, whispered alone in the dark? History cannot say, but we can imagine. He dined with Nero, he slept beside him, he was taken on public tours, presented to foreign dignitaries as the emperor's consort. Statues of Poppaea remained throughout the palaces, but now Sporus stood before them, living, breathing, and dying a little more each day within their shadow. This was no love story. It was possession masquerading as grief, performance replacing personhood. Every element of his identity, his past, his body, his name, was overwritten. He was not merely silenced, he was erased, and in that erasure, we find the deepest horror. For nearly 2 years, Sporus lived this way, not as himself, but as a reflection of Nero's need, a beautiful ghost puppeteered for the comfort of a madman. There are no surviving letters from Sporus, no recorded words, not even a physical description beyond the cruel note of his resemblance to Poppaea. The boy disappeared behind the mask he was forced to wear, and yet, the silence speaks volumes. Meanwhile, the empire crumbled. Nero's spending had drained the treasury, his artistic whims grew more excessive, and his political decisions increasingly erratic. Rebellions flared across the provinces. The Senate, long humiliated, found its courage. In 68 AD, the tide finally turned. Faced with certain execution, Nero fled the city with a handful of loyal freedmen, Sporus among them. In a quiet villa on the outskirts of Rome, the emperor who once ruled the world held a dagger to his own throat. As soldiers approached, Nero hesitated. He could not bring himself to do it. It was his secretary, Epaphroditus, who finally helped him drive the blade home. His last words? "What an artist dies in me." And so fell Nero, not with dignity, but with delusion. For Sporus, the death of his captor did not bring liberation, it brought exposure. Now unprotected, he became a curiosity, a relic of Nero's madness. He was shuffled from patron to patron, each more interested in the spectacle than the soul. First Nymphidius Sabinus, a praetorian prefect who briefly tried to seize the throne. He too treated Sporus as a consort, adopting Nero's twisted precedent. But his reign lasted mere months before he was murdered by his own troops. Then came Otho, one of Nero's former companions, who also married Sporus. Again, the same tragic theater, the same ghostly role, a new man, the same mask. What did Sporus feel during these years? Perhaps numbness, perhaps a flicker of hope each time power shifted, but the pattern never changed. Until Vitellius, the next short-lived emperor in Rome's infamous Year of the Four Emperors, had a different plan for Sporus. Where Nero had sought to recreate a love, Vitellius sought entertainment. He proposed a public spectacle for the Colosseum, a reenactment of the myth of Proserpina, the goddess of spring, abducted and violated by Pluto, lord of the underworld. Sporus would play the role of Proserpina in the arena, before a crowd of thousands, likely to be raped or torn apart as a live-action performance of mythic brutality. It was to be the final degradation, and Sporus, after years of silent endurance, of performing a lie for the sake of survival, made his choice. He took his own life. No final words are recorded, no epitaph, only this, that a boy once stolen from himself, sculpted into a fiction, and paraded as an empress, chose death over one more humiliation, and in that act, we find a glimmer, however faint, of something long denied to him, agency. His life had been twisted into a grotesque reflection of power's worst instincts, but his death, that was his own. The Roman historians who wrote of Sporus, Suetonius, Cassius Dio, Tacitus, did so not with compassion, but with contempt for Nero. Sporus was a symbol, a footnote to imperial excess, a curiosity, a freak, but they missed the real story. They missed the child stolen from himself. They missed the daily agony of forced performance. They missed the quiet courage in that final decision, because Sporus was not merely a victim of Nero, he was a victim of Rome, of a system that allowed emperors to play God, that cheered while boys were castrated and identities erased for the pleasure of the few. And yet, across the gulf of centuries, we can still hear the echoes. Sporus matters. Not because of what was done to him, but because he endured. Because even in silence, there is resistance. Because to choose death, but not out of despair, but to reject a final indignity, is an act of tragic heroism. History is filled with the names of emperors, of generals, of conquerors. But behind them, beneath them, lie the unmarked graves of those crushed underfoot. Sporus is one such name we must not forget, because the true lesson of this story is not about Nero's madness. It is about the human cost of unchecked power. It is about how easy it is to turn people into props, into parodies, into reflections of our own desire. And it is about the unbearable strength it takes simply to say no. So the next time we study the grandeur of Rome, the aqueducts, the legions, the marble temples, remember that behind those triumphs stand ghosts like Sporus, and they too deserve to be remembered. Let us return one last time to that day in 67 AD, the glittering parade in Rome, the warm sun gleaming off Nero's chariot, the adoring crowds forced into applause. There stands the emperor, bloated by delusion and flattery, and beside him, veiled in silk, his bride, a vision of beauty, silent, obedient, empty. How many in the crowd knew the truth? How many dared to speak it? That this woman was a boy, taken, cut, and sculpted into a facsimile of love by a man who had killed the original. The image is haunting, but it is not isolated. Rome, for all its achievements, was a civilization built on contradiction, a republic that became a dictatorship, a society that celebrated liberty for the few and enslavement for the many. In such a place, power became performance, and performance, survival. Sporus, more than almost anyone, lived at the intersection of these forces. His life was not one of choices, but of impositions. He did not speak his truth, because truth was not a luxury he could afford. To exist under Nero was to be what Nero needed: a beautiful mirror, a compliant shadow, a symbol without substance. But it is precisely this transformation, this horror, that speaks to a deeper, more enduring truth. Because Sporus' story is not just about one boy and one emperor. It is about the way systems erase people. It is about how institutions, be they empires, corporations, or ideologies, can strip individuals of identity, autonomy, and meaning, all in service of a dominant narrative. In Sporus' case, that narrative was Nero's grief, Nero's guilt, Nero's fantasy. But take away the togas, the marble, the spectacle, and the pattern remains familiar. How often, even today, do we force people into roles they never asked for? How often are the vulnerable reshaped to satisfy the needs of the powerful? These are not just historical questions, they are human ones. And that is why telling Sporus' story matters, because it reminds us that history is not just the tale of victors and villains. It is the memory of those who endured, silently, invisibly, and against all odds. It is the memory of the boy beneath the veil, of the child who was never allowed to grow up, of the human being who in his final act reclaimed the only thing he had left, his end. Some might argue that Sporus had no agency, that he was merely a passive victim swept up in the currents of history. But that final choice, to die on his own terms, belies that notion. It was a whisper of defiance, a final refusal. In a world that saw him as an object, a curiosity, a symbol, Sporus reminded us, however fleetingly, that he was a person, that he had a self, and that despite all efforts, it could not be completely taken from him. So let us not forget him. Let us say his name, not as Papaya, not as Nero's bride, but as Sporus, a boy who should have lived a quiet, invisible life, and instead became a silent witness to the madness of emperors. He reminds us that history is not kind, but we can be. We can choose to remember the pain behind the pageantry. We can choose to honor the ones whose voices were stolen. We can choose to see not just the glory of Rome, but the ghosts it left behind. And maybe in doing so, we can create a future where no child is ever forced to wear a mask they didn't choose, and where no one has to die just to be seen.